Welcome back, dear friends, to the Crimson Academy's course on the Advent of Divine Justice. Dear friends, this is the Crimson Academy's course, Exploring the Advent of Divine Justice. We are on part 6, and in this section, dear friends, we will be covering paragraph 16. That's right, dear friends, just one paragraph for this section. And in this section, dear friends, the major topics that will be covered are the Onward March, obstacles, defections of prominent Bahá'ís, ministry of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, ministry of Shoghi Effendi, corruption, moral laxity, and engrained prejudice. So dear friends, let us read paragraph 16. A community relatively negligible in its numerical strength, separated by vast distances from both the focal center of its faith and the land wherein the preponderating mass of its fellow believers reside, bereft in the main of material resources and lacking in experience and in prominence, ignorant of the beliefs, concepts, and habits of those peoples and races from which its spiritual founders have sprung, wholly unfamiliar with the languages in which its sacred books were originally revealed, constrained to place its sole reliance upon an inadequate rendering of only a fragmentary portion of the literature embodying its laws, its tenets, and its history, subjected from its infancy to tests of extreme severity, involving at times the defection of some of its most prominent members, having to contend ever since its inception and in an ever-increasing measure with the forces of corruption, of moral laxity, and engrained prejudice. Such a community, in less than half a century and unaided by any of its sister communities, whether in the East or in the West, has, by virtue of the celestial potency with which an all-loving Master has abundantly endowed it, lent an impetus to the onward march of the cause it has espoused, which the combined achievements of its co-religionists in the West have failed to rival. Introduction to paragraph 16. The beloved guardian praises the achievements of the North American Bahá'í community, despite obstacles it has faced since its birth. Dear friends, in this section, we will study the origin and the birth of the North American Bahá'í community. Next, we explore the defection of prominent Bahá'ís as one of the challenges. And then finally, dear friends, we will explore the three forces of corruption: moral laxity and engrained prejudice that the North American Bahá'í community has had to battle since its inception. So what are some major key points of paragraph 16? The Bahá'í faith was introduced in the United States when two Bahá'ís from what is now Lebanon, Anton Haddad and Dr. Ibrahim Khairallah, moved to New York in 1892 to find work. The classes Dr. Ibrahim Khairallah started in Chicago to teach the faith in 1895 attracted a significant number of souls. After visiting ʻAbdu'l-Bahá in 1898, some of the American believers realized that the curriculum taught by Dr. Khairallah was not a true representation of the Bahá'í scriptures. In 1900, Dr. Khairullah decided to break away from ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and to start his own sect in collaboration with Bhai Mirza Muhammad Ali, Ahmad Sohrab, and Mrs. Julia Lynch Chandler, who set up the New History Society in New York in 1929, confronted the American National Spiritual Assembly, and as a result, were expelled from the Baha'i community. Corruption is the use of power by people in authority for illegitimate personal gain, either for private enrichment or to stay in power. Other major points, dear friends. Corruption in America is a systematic and endemic. It influences the American system of government, the operation of corporations, and business and trade relationships. The dramatic changes that occurred in the United States after World War I undermined the role of Christianity in society and its moral influence on people. There is strong evidence indicating that racial prejudice is deeply entrenched in American society and in the minds of many of its citizens. Dear friends, in paragraph 16, the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi highlights the significant advances made by the North American Baha'i community over the previous 50 years, in spite of the many obstacles and challenges that they have had to overcome. Their progress has exceeded the combined achievements of all the other Baha'i communities in the West. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi identifies the following obstacles faced by the community. Insignificant number of believers, geographically remote from Persia, the birthplace of the faith, and the Holy Land, its focal center, and a lack of material resources, experience, and prominence. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi identifies the following obstacles faced by the Baha'i community. Unfamiliar with Arabic and Farsi, the languages in which the sacred books were originally revealed, relying on only a fragment of literature, providing the laws, tenets, and history of the faith. Experiencing severe spiritual tests from the early days due to the defection of some of its most prominent members, and having to contend with the negative forces of corruption, moral laxity, and prejudice dominating the wider community. How did the faith be introduced in America? The introduction of the Baha'i faith in the United States had a very humble start. In 1892, two Baha'is of Christian background from a region that today is Lebanon, Anton Haddad and Dr. Ibrahim Khairullah, traveled to New York to find work. Dr. Khairullah had become a Baha'i in Cairo and had received a tablet from His Holiness Baha'u'llah. He had also been in communication with His Holiness ʻAbdu'l-Bahá. And here are pictures of Anton Haddad and Dr. Ibrahim Khairullah. In 1894, Haddad went back to Europe to participate in the Antwerp International Art Fair, and then he returned to Syria. Dr. Ibrahim Khairullah decided to settle down in Chicago and earn a living as a spiritual healer. He also started some classes to teach the Baha'i faith to Americans. At that time, the Baha'i scriptures were not available in English. Here, dear friends, is pictures of the Antwerp Universal Exhibition 1894, and that is the location of where the exhibition was held. And so Anton Haddad went back, but Ibrahim Khairullah, he stayed and settled down in Chicago. Dr. Khairullah was not fully aware of the Baha'i social teachings and the fundamental verities of the faith. Hence, devised a curriculum based on his skill of spiritual healing, biblical prophecies referring to Baha'u'llah and his impression of the teachings and fundamentals of the faith. The classes proved quite popular and attracted many people. Within 2 years, Dr. Khairullah was informing ʻAbdu'l-Bahá about his remarkable success. And here, dear friends, I have defined verity because, as I said, Dr. Khairullah was not fully aware of the Baha'i social teachings and the fundamental verities. So what is verity? Verity is a true principle or belief, especially one of fundamental importance. So he was not fully aware of the fundamental verities of the faith. In 1895, Dr. Khairullah started weekly classes teaching the Baha'i faith in Kenosha. By 1896, there were hundreds of believers in Chicago and Kenosha. In 1897, he visited Kansas City, New York City, Ithaca, and Philadelphia, attracting a significant number of souls. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi names the most prominent among those who were converted to the faith in that period as the stout-hearted Thornton Chase, surnamed Sabet, steadfast, by ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, and designated by him the first American believer who became a convert to the faith in 1894. The immortal Louisa A. Moore, the mother teacher of the West, surnamed Liva, Banner, by ʻAbdu'l-Bahá. Dr. Edward Getzinger, to whom she was later married, Howard McNutt, Arthur P. Dodge, Isabella D. Brittingham, Lillian F. Hobbs, Paul K. Dealey, Chester I. Thatcher, and Helen S. Goodall. And here's a beautiful picture of Thornton Chase, the first Western convert to the Baha'i faith. And here's a picture of the first Baha'is in Kenosha, the first 18 Baha'is in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Khairullah completed his first series of lessons on January 1st, 1898, and brought into being the third Baha'i group in North America, Byron Lane. And you can see Byron Lane is the first Baha'i in Kenosha. He's seated in the center of the second row. By 1899, dear friends, the size of the American Baha'i community had reached 1,500. Various Baha'i communities emerged in Chicago, New York, Kenosha, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, northern New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Racine. Here's a picture of spring 1900, a gathering of Baha'is from Chicago. You can see how the Baha'i community is starting to flourish. But what happened? In paragraph 16, the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi refers to the defection of some of its most prominent members as one of the challenges that the North American Baha'i community had to deal with. These defections occurred during both the ministries of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi. One of the major incidents that resulted in the defection of some prominent Baha'is was the rebellion of Dr. Khairullah in the time of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá. In 1898, Mrs. Phoebe Hurst, who had been introduced to faith by Mrs. Lua Getzinger, had plans to visit ʻAbdu'l-Bahá in the Holy Land. And here, dear friends, is a beautiful picture of Lua Getzinger, 1871 to 1916, and she was a disciple of His Holiness ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, titled Herald of the Covenant and Mother of the Believers. Mrs. Lua Getzinger invited other believers to join her. The invitation attracted a number of people, including Dr. and Mrs. Getzinger, Dr. Gerla and his wife, May Ellis Bowles, Miss Pearson, Ann Apperson, Mrs. Thornborough, and her daughter, Dr. Gerla's daughters, and their grandmother. Here's a picture of the first Western Baha'i pilgrims, pictured in the winter of 1898. And you can see in the center, Ibrahim George Gerla, and Lua Getzinger sits second from the right. And you can see a beautiful picture of her. And standing in the left is Robert Turner. And dear friends, we will be talking about Robert Turner in another section. So that will be coming up. This historic pilgrimage created an opportunity for the American believers to initiate direct contact and communication with His Holiness ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, and to learn from him about the verities of the faith. Interestingly, dear friends, they suddenly realized that the curriculum taught by Dr. Gerla was not a true representation of the Baha'i scriptures, and many of his ideas contradicted the concepts enshrined in the writings of Baha'u'llah. Here's a picture of a group of Baha'is in Haifa with Ibrahim Gerla, and in the second row and in the center, there he is, and Edward Getzinger, and this is in the second row, second from the right, and sitting next to Mishrin Alam, the immortal calligrapher of the Baha'i faith. And you can see the date of it is Nowruz, March 21st, 1899. This resulted in crisis and disunity as soon as the believers returned from the Holy Land in December 1899. Contrary to what the pilgrims had discovered, Gerla insisted that his teachings represented orthodox Baha'i belief and were correct. Others denied his claim and asserted that the friends should turn to ʻAbdu'l-Bahá for guidance. After 2 years, in 1900, Dr. Gerla decided to break away from ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and to start his own sect. Only a small portion of the American Baha'is followed him. However, the disunity affected around half of the American believers, who became alienated and left the faith. The beloved guardian refers to this episode in the early years of the ministry of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá as devastating crisis, which the ambition of Dr. Gerla had upon his return from the Holy Land precipitated. The agitation which he, working in collaboration with the arch-breaker of the covenant and his messengers, had provoked the attacks launched by him and his fellow seceders, as well as by Christian ecclesiastics, increasingly jealous of the rising power and extending influence of the faith. And we find this reference, dear friends, in God Passes By, page 260. One of the messengers mentioned in Shoghi Effendi's statement was Shoghi, Mirza Muhammad Ali's son, who traveled to the United States to specifically meet Dr. Gerla. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi denounces Gerla as the greedy and conceited Ibrahim Gerla, who had chosen to uphold the banner of his rebellion in America for no less than 20 years, and who had the temerity to denounce in writing ʻAbdu'l-Bahá, his false teachings, his misrepresentations of Baha'ism, his dissimulation, and to stigmatize his visit to America as a death blow to the cause of God. This was in God Passes By, page 319. One of the major goals of Shoghi Effendi from the beginning of his ministry was to develop the framework of the Bahá'í administrative order based on the guidance provided by Baha'u'llah and ʻAbdu'l-Bahá. This was major cultural change that some Baha'is in North America did not find easy to accept. Hence, some of the believers drifted away, as reflected in the US Census that reports of the number of Baha'is in 1926 was 1,247 compared to 2,884 in 1916. There was also some opposition to the initiatives of the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi. For example, Ruth White in 1926 to 1929 opposed the organizational changes pursued by the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi. She rejected the authority of Shoghi Effendi as the guardian of the faith appointed by ʻAbdu'l-Bahá and claimed that the will and testament of ʻAbdu'l-Bahá was a forgery. Mirza Ahmad Sohrab, ʻAbdu'l-Bahā's secretary and interpreter, and Mrs. Julia Chandler set up the New History Society in New York in 1929 to indirectly teach the faith. They were told that they should operate within the Bahá'í institutions, and local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of New York was to have an input into how the New History Society promoted the faith. Sohrab and Chandler declined to work with the New York Assembly. This resulted in a confrontation with the National Spiritual Assembly and eventually expulsion from the Bahá'í community. Corruption. Corruption is the use of power in authority for illegitimate personal gain, either for private enrichment, referred to as extraction, or to stay in power, known as power preservation. There are often connections between these two forms of corruption, particularly in major corruption scandals. Corruption can happen in many different contexts. Political corruption occurs at the highest levels of the political system. Administrative or bureaucratic corruption occurs at the legal implementation end of politics. Corruption can also be in the form of dishonesty in the conduct and the business of an individual. The ancient Greeks understood corruption as a problem of moral decay and deviation from a healthy system of government. In England during the 18th century, corruption was seen as the intrusion of the executive on the legislature by giving bribes of or offering a favor. Corruption is often identified by one of the following behaviors: bribery, which is the giving or offering of a bribe; extortion, the practice of obtaining something, particularly money, through force or the threat of force; cronyism, the appointment of friends and associates to positions of authority without proper regard to their qualifications; nepotism is the practice of favoring relatives or friends, particularly by giving them jobs. Patronage politics is the distribution of favors or rewards such as public office, jobs, contracts, subsidies, prestige by a patron to a client. Influence peddling is the illegal practice of using one's influence in government or connections with people in authority to obtain favors or preferential treatment for one another, usually in return for money. Graft. This is dishonest use of political authority for personal gain. And Embezzlement. This is theft or misappropriation of funds placed in one's trust or belonging to one's employer. Also, gerrymandering. In the United States of America, this is the practice since the founding of the country of allowing state politicians to set boundaries of electoral districts, not a possibility for Senate seats, often by incumbent political party to strengthen or weaken the power of a political party or a racial group, especially since the franchise to vote was extended to racial minorities. The courts have attempted with limited success to set legal and political standards to prevent the rigging of election boundaries. In the context, dear friends, to political accumulation and extraction include bribes, commissions, fees taken from private sector businesses, undue extraction through taxation and customs, fraud and economic crime, politically created rent-seeking opportunities, politically created market favors benefiting businesses owned by political elites, off-budget transfers, manipulated processes of privatization and extorted partying and campaign funding from the state, private sector, and voters. And dear friends, this was an interesting article that I'm sharing. This is entitled Political Corruption, Anti-Corruption Resource Center. And you can see this is by Inge Amundsen. And this is also from the same author. On the other hand, corrupt means of power preservation consist of buying political support and majorities from other parties and politicians, co-optation and maintenance of patron-client networks, buying decisions from parliament, judiciary, control and oversight bodies, favoritism and patronage in allocation of government resources, buying voters and votes, electoral fraud, use of public money for political campaigns, and buying off media and civil society. So these are all examples of corruption. In general, dear friends, corruption, and in particular political corruption, has been dominant phenomena in politics in nearly every country of the world throughout human history. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi, however, highlights corruption in America because of its systemic and endemic nature and its persistent influence on the American system of government, operation of corporations and businesses and trade relationships. Political corruption in the United States is old as the nation. For example, in 1829, Samuel Swartwout, the collector of customs for the port of New York, appointed by President Andrew Jackson, embezzled over $1 million in custom receipts and fled to Europe. Wherever corruption exists, there have been efforts to combat it through reforms. The most important events and transformation in American history, such as the American Revolution, the development of democracy, and the Civil War, and period after that, the Reconstruction, have been fraught with corruption and reform. And here, as you can see on the right, this is a picture of Samuel Swartwout, and this is a political cartoon of him. This is him embezzling more than $1 million and then fleeing to Europe. Some aspects of political corruption, as described, have remained unchanged in the United States throughout the centuries. Greed, secrecy, and conspiracy are the dominant forces in politics. Public office is exploited for private interest. The law is searched for loopholes. and political enemies are accused of corruption. On the other hand, some features of corruption have changed and practices that were acceptable in the past are now forbidden. And here's a political cartoon. It says, "Hey, Mr. Government official, what's going on under there?" And you can see this, he's got a cloak of secrecy. It says, "Trust me, you don't need to know." Political corruption is interwoven with American democracy to the extent that even some legal practices in United States politics can be considered as corrupt. And this is an interesting, this comes from the Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig, describes how special interest money systemically corrupts American politics. The members of the United States Congress are heavily dependent on funding from large donors for their political survival. Lessig argues that such a practice, though legal, is a systemic problem and a form of corruption. The members of the Congress spend 3 of every 5 weekdays raising money for re-election. In this process, the members take up less than important issues in order to intimidate corporations and to force them to become campaign contributors. The complexity of the tax system and various special exceptions encourage this process. This is also from Professor Lawrence Lessig, writes, "The clients of the lobbyists get a better chance at changing government policy in a world of endless government spending and government regulation. That chance can be enormously lucrative. As researchers at the University of Kansas calculated the return on lobbyists' investment to modify the American Jobs Creation Act of 2004 to create a tax benefit was 22,000%. A paper published in 2009 calculates that on average, for every dollar that an average firm spends to lobby for targeted tax benefits, the return is between $6 and $20. So lobbyists have far more effect. The major scandals that have unfolded in the United States over the last few decades clearly highlight the depth and breadth of corruption in that country as highlighted by Shoghi Effendi. And here's a little illustration. Lobbying is an American word for legalized bribery. It's perfectly legal to bribe a politician in America. No wonder the country is corrupt to its core. The system goes like this. So in the first illustration, it is illegal to receive money directly from a special interest group to a politician. That's illegal. But the special interest group can give money to the lobbyist, and then the lobbyist can give money to the politician. Now we're going into moral laxity. Alexis de Tocqueville, 1805 to 1859, French statesman, historian, and social philosopher, wrote, "In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. And there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than that its influence is most powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth." So he said, here in America, there can be no greater proof of its utility. There's no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence than in America. Such an observation, however, lost its validity as the 20th century unfolded. The dramatic changes that occurred in the United States after World War I undermined the role of Christianity in the society. and its moral influence on people. Before the 1920s, values and morality were respected, and everyone was expected to live by them. Women were trained to be sophisticated and reserved. There was no smoking or drinking permitted in public. The family was the critical unit in early American society and comprised a husband, wife, biological children, and extended family. Divorce was rare. It was generally illegal to live together or have children outside of marriage. In the early 19th century, the family gained more importance as a source of happiness, but its nature started to change. Common law marriage became an acceptable form of union. Companionate marriage, in which couples consented to have no children, and divorce by mutual consent with no financial or economic claim on each other, became widespread. This resulted in a rapid tripling of the divorce rate between 1860 and 1910. In the 1920s, Christian values and morality started to be replaced by a new morality under a social liberalism, emphasizing freedom and equality for everyone. These changes were particularly pronounced in the metropolitan areas of northern and western US liberalism, a political or social philosophy advocating the freedom of the individual, parliamentary systems of government, non-violent modification of political, social, or economic institutions to assure unrestricted development in all spheres of human endeavor, and governmental guarantees of individual rights and civil liberties. Concepts promoted by liberalism are generally positive and progressive and can significantly advance society. However, like any ideology, when it is not pursued holistically, and in particular when some of its elements are taken to an extreme, it can become a source of harm. The liberalist movement in the United States in this period was also a reaction to the fundamentalism that started among conservative Presbyterian theologians at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 19th century and spread to conservatives in Baptist and other denominations in 1920 to 1930. And here is a picture of the Princeton Theological Seminary in the 19th century. Social liberalism gave rise to envy and greed amongst the lower classes of society. Hence, many Americans went into debt to buy consumer goods such as cars, radios, and home appliances. Its impact on sexuality was quite observable. Prior to the 1920s, Protestant values of chastity and modesty dominated American culture. Sexual relationships outside traditional marriage were regarded as immoral and vile. And here you can see it in the picture. It says 1910, 39,300 cars sold. But in 1924, 587,341 cars sold. So you can see the stark contrast. And in the bottom picture, it's a picture of women at a social gathering. And the attire they're wearing is in stark contrast to the attire they wore even less than 5 to 10 years earlier. Social liberalism gave rise to envy and greed amongst the lower classes of society. You can see this greed. In the 1920s, concepts about sexuality underwent a radical change. People came more receptive to explicit sexual behavior outside of marriage as promoted by motion pictures, plays, songs, novels, and advertising. A new generation of women in the 1920s, known as flappers, were stylish and smoked and drank in public. They dressed provocatively and revealingly and sought independence and other social freedoms. These young women not only embraced their sexuality, but often publicly displayed it. So you can see here some pictures of women in far more provocative outfits than 10 years earlier. Moral laxity has continued to affect more Americans in decades that followed and intensified its negative impact on the fabric of the American society, to the extent that the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi has considered it as one of the negative forces hampering the progress of the North American Baha'i community. Engrained Prejudice. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was fought over two fundamental issues that had not been resolved during the American Revolution. The Northern victory in the war ensured the unity of the United States as one nation and legally ended the institution of slavery through the 13th Amendment. In the South, African Americans found a new life after slavery, free from the brutality and indignities they experienced during slavery. However, prejudice and discrimination against African Americans persisted. Southern state governments legislated black codes to give African Americans the rights to marry, own property, and sue in court. However, colored people could not serve on juries, testify against rights, or serve in state militias. Most Southern African Americans lived in extreme poverty and were forced to rent land from the previous white slave owners, and a portion of their crops were given to the landowner as rent. Here's a cartoon saying black codes, laws passed by the South that limited the rights of African Americans. You can see a picture of, on the right, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and this is a picture of the black codes designed to oppress and keep African Americans down. During the Reconstruction era, 1865 through 1877, Congress passed laws to promote civil and political rights of African Americans across the South. The opportunities provided were welcomed by African Americans. As a result, 700 African American men served in elected public office. 2 were elected as state senators, and 14 became members of the House of Representatives, and 1,300 African American men and women held government jobs. And here's a picture, dear friends, of the first colored Senate and representatives. But what happened? A hate group against Reconstruction called the Ku Klux Klan, the first movement emerged in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, the KKK. Members demanded the restoration of white supremacy through violence and intimidation against African Americans. White supremacy is a racist ideology that claims white people are the dominant race. Supremacy groups in the world vary according to whom they envisage to be white and which racial groups are considered as the primary enemy. Under pressure from the federal government, this is very interesting, dear friends, under pressure from the federal government, the KKK started to disappear, particularly when their objectives were achieved in the 1870s. From the late 1870s, Southern states passed laws to segregate whites from persons of color. In public transportation, school parks, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, the persons of color refer to anyone with any degree of Black ancestry. These laws were known as the Jim Crow laws and were enforced until 1954, when the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. And I'm sure, dear friends, you've seen pictures of these. Here's just a few. It says, drinking fountain, white and color. It says public swimming pool, white only. And this is a young child that says, we won't go to school with Negroes. Racial prejudice and animosity towards those who were not considered as real Americans continued into the 20th century. The majority of African Americans did not benefit from the economic prosperity of the 1920s and early 1930s. With industrial development and the emergence of manufacturing jobs, many African Americans moved north to work in industrial cities such as New York, Chicago, and Detroit. With the settlement of African Americans in various parts of these cities, Black neighborhoods known as ghettos started to emerge. This was called the Great Migration. And this is African American family from the rural South arriving in Chicago, 1922. But what happened again? The development of Black neighborhoods resulted in the revival of the KKK. This is the second movement in 1915. It took its inspiration from the D.W. 1915 silent film, The Birth of a Nation, which mythologized the founding of the first Klan. The KKK movement extended its campaign to include discrimination against Roman Catholics, Jews, and Mexicans at a time of high emigration from the mostly Catholic nations of Central and Southern Europe. This time, its membership increased to over 100,000 in 1921, to this time, 5 million by the mid-1920s. But it started to decrease towards the late 1920s. And you can see in the top picture, this is the movie D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. This was what inspired the KKK second movement. And in the bottom, you can see the KKK march on Washington. In this part, we have given a brief background why the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi, refers to ingrained prejudice as one of the maladies affecting North American society. There is strong evidence indicating that racial prejudice has continued to be prevalent in American society in spite of strict anti-discrimination legislations. Racial segregation in American cities, the biased negative attitudes of whites towards other ethnic and racial groups, social separation and isolation of racial groups, and many other factors demonstrate, dear friends, that prejudice is deeply entrenched in American society and in the minds of many of its citizens. This is an illustration of these three evils in American society: corruption, racism, moral laxity, materialism. Thank you very much, dear friends. Thank you. We look forward to presenting our next section with you. Thank you.